let me tell you something about Steve Rogers that I don't think gets said enough. He is the best character the MCU has ever produced. The most complete, the most human. And I will die on that hill every single time. And I know some people are going to push back on that, who think the mantle was passed and the story continued, and that's fine. And look, I'm not here to tell you how to feel about Sam Wilson. I love Sam Wilson. But I will tell you this. What Steve Rogers is, that specific combination of courage and moral clarity, and the kind of leadership that makes every person in the room stand a little straighter, that is not something that you hand to someone else and call it the same thing. That is not a mantle. That is a person. And Marvel knows that. And that's why he's coming back. But here's the thing that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since the Doomsday casting was announced. Steve's return isn't fan service. It isn't nostalgia bait. It is the most important casting in this entire movie. And by the end of this video, I think you're going to understand why. Because there is something coming for Steve Rogers in Doomsday that I think is going to be the single most devastating moment in this entire film. My name is Braden. I went to school for film and animation. I'm building my own comic book universe from scratch, and I've been pulling on Marvel threads since 2008. If you got the last video, the Doctor Doom and Tony Stark deep dive, then you already know where I'm coming from with this. What I want to talk about today is Steve Rogers specifically, who he actually is, why he matters to Doomsday, and why the relationship between Steve and Doom, two men who have never shared a scene before in the MCU, might be the emotional spine of this entire movie. So let's get into it. I want to start with a moment that I think about more than almost any other moment in the MCU. Dr. Erskine is talking to Steve before the procedure, and he doesn't talk about strength or tactics or what Steve is about to become. He just tells him something simple, that the serum amplifies what is already inside a person. Good becomes great, bad becomes worse, and that he chose Steve, not because of his body, not because he was the most qualified candidate by any conventional measure, but because he was a good man, because goodness was already there, fully formed. And then Erskine is gone, and his last act on this earth is pointing at Steve's heart. And I think about that every time someone talks about Captain America as a mantle you can pass down, because Erskine's whole point was that you cannot manufacture what Steve has. You cannot replicate it, or transfer it, or hand it to someone else and call it the same thing. The serum didn't make Steve Rogers. Everything that matters about this man was already there in a skinny kid from Brooklyn who could not make himself walk away from something wrong, no matter how many times it got him beaten up in an alley. And then there's Endgame. Steve Rogers is standing alone, facing Thanos and his entire army with half a shield. And he tightens the strap on what's left of it, and he walks forward anyway. No version of that moment where he wins. He just could not stand still while something wrong was happening in front of him. That is the exact same kid from Brooklyn making the exact same choice he always made, just because he genuinely cannot be anything else. And I think that's what makes his return in Doomsday feel like so much more than fan service, because we have seen Steve Rogers tested every way you can test a person. We have watched him lose friends, lose decades, lose the world he knew, but we have never, not once in 17 years, seen Steve Rogers as a father. And I think that changes everything about who he is walking into this movie, because fatherhood doesn't make you stronger the way this serum did. It makes you vulnerable in a way that nothing else can. It gives someone a way to reach you that no amount of courage or willpower can defend against. Steve Rogers the soldier has been tested. Steve Rogers the Avenger has been tested. Steve Rogers the father, we have never met that version of him. And I think Avengers Doomsday is going to introduce us to him right before it breaks him. At the end of Endgame, Steve Rogers does something that I think surprised a lot of people in the theater. He goes back to 1945, back to the life that was taken from him before he ever really got to live it. And when we see him again, he's sitting on a bench by a lake, an old man in the sun, and he looks for the first time in his entire life at peace. And I think the reason this moment hits so hard is because of what it cost him to get there. Because Steve Rogers spent his entire life being selfless. That was his whole identity. The kid from Brooklyn who could never put himself first, who gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left to give. And then Endgame asked him to give one more thing, and he did, and when it was over, he finally chose himself. And here's what makes that arc so remarkable when you hold it next to Tony's. Tony Stark started selfish, brilliant, arrogant, the center of his own universe. And then the world cracked him open, and slowly, painfully, across 11 years of storytelling, he became someone who could give everything for people he never even met. Tony's arc moved towards selflessness, and Steve's arc moved toward finally choosing himself. And those two lines crossed together and overlapped each other and shaped each other across the entire Infinity Saga in a way that I think is some of the most carefully constructed character writing in the history of blockbuster storytelling. They made each other who they needed to become. Steve pulled Tony towards something worth dying for, and Tony gave Steve a world worth living in. And Marvel planned that, every step of it. So when Steve sits down at the bench, I think we're watching a man who finally got to make his own choice for the first time. And that matters. That's earned, that's beautiful. But I also think there's something else happening in that moment that we didn't fully understand when we first saw it. Because here's the thing about Steve Rogers going back and living his life. He didn't just disappear in 1945 and close his eyes. He was out there watching history unfold from the inside. And if rumors around Doomsday are right, then Steve Rogers has been navigating the multiverse in one form or another for a long time, long before this movie even starts. And if that's true, if Steve has been living inside the edges of his story for longer than any of us realized, then that bench scene looks completely different on a rewatch. Because that's a man who has already watched everything we are about to see play out. Doomsday, Secret Wars, all of it. That quiet moment by the lake that we all read as a happy ending, I think it's something much heavier than that. I think we were watching a man who had already been through the worst of it, sitting in the sun, carrying the full weight of everything he'd seen and everything he'd lost. And the reason that realization hits so hard is because of what it means for the movie we're about to watch. Every scene with Steve in Doomsday, every choice he makes, every devastating thing that happens to him, he may have already lived through all of it once before. There's a version of longing that Steve carries through every single MCU movie that I think a lot of us recognize, even if we've never been frozen in ice for 70 years. That feeling of living in a world that has moved on without you, that's loud and fast and unfamiliar in ways that are hard to explain to people who seem perfectly comfortable in it. That quiet ache for something that felt simpler and warmer and more like home. I think that's part of why this character lives in me the way he does. The whole reason this channel exists. The retro nostalgia vibes, the VCR tapes, the cozy warmth of wanting to go back to the era of Marvel that almost never missed. That comes from the same place Steve Rogers was standing for most of his life, reaching back towards something, longing for a time the world had already moved past. And then Endgame gave him the dance. That moment they set up in the first Avenger, Steve promising her a date, the war getting in the way of everything, Marvel held onto that for 11 years and paid it off in the quietest, most beautiful way possible. Finally in the life he was always supposed to have. Finally home. That is what Steve Rogers is living when Loki finds him. And I want to be clear about something. Loki showing up is not a betrayal of that peace. It's a complication of it. Because Steve listens. He always listens when something genuinely matters. And whatever Loki has become by this point, whatever he's been through, whatever changed him, Steve recognizes it. Recognizes the weight of someone telling the truth at a cost to themselves. So when Loki tells him the TV has flagged his timeline, that staying means getting pruned, that the only way to protect his family is to move, Steve makes the choice he always makes. He puts the people he loves ahead of everything else. Loki brings them to Earth 828. And I love this detail because it fits so perfectly. A retro world, the home of the Fantastic Four, a place that feels like it exists slightly outside the chaos of the modern MCU in the best way possible. And Steve builds something real there. A home, a family, a son, a life that finally looks the way it was always supposed to look. And then the Russos said something that I keep coming back to, that Doomsday is a sort of sequel to Endgame. Not to the multiverse saga, but to Endgame specifically. That framing feels like an acknowledgement. Like Marvel knows where they lost some of us, and they're reaching back to find us again. Steve Rogers reaching back for Peggy, the Russos reaching back to Endgame, this channel reaching back to the era when Marvel felt like magic. It's all the same instinct. And then Dr. Doom shows up at Steve's door. Full armor, mask on, the Fantastic Four behind him, and everything Steve has built, the family, the hard-earned peace, suddenly feels very fragile. And the question that Steve cannot shake, the one thing that is going to drive everything that comes next, is why. I want to talk about something that I think is the most underrated relationship in the entire MCU. Not underrated in the sense that people don't love it. I mean, everyone loves it. But underrated in the sense that I don't think most people fully understand what it was actually doing underneath the surface, what it was holding together, what the entire Infinity Saga was actually built around. Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. Because on the surface, it looks like a rivalry. Two men fundamentally disagreed about almost everything, about oversight, about trust, about what it means to be responsible for a world you had the power to break. They spent years on opposite sides of a line that neither of them fully wanted to draw. But underneath all of that friction was something that I think both of them knew, even when they couldn't say it. That they needed each other. That something about the specific push and pull between these two men was load-bearing in a way that went beyond friendship or rivalry or ideology. Tony needed Steve to keep him human, because every time the darkness crept in, every Ultron, every moment Tony pushed further than he should have, Steve was there as the one person who pushed back because he genuinely believed Tony was better than the choices he was making. Steve never stopped believing that, even in Siberia when everything between them was broken and bleeding on a cold floor. He left his shield behind because some part of him still believed Tony might need it more than he did. And Steve needed Tony too. Tony gave Steve a reason to keep showing up for a world that had moved on without him. They shaped each other. Across 11 years, across every argument and every reconciliation, and every moment they stood shoulder to shoulder against something neither of them could face alone. What I'm about to tell you reframes everything we just talked about in a way that goes very deep. Tony Stark was not an accident. He was not just a billionaire who had a change of heart in a cave. He was a variant, a version of the most dangerous mind in the history of the multiverse, Victor Von Doom, engineered from the ground up by He Who Remains, rewritten, renamed, given everything the real Doom never had. He Who Remains wasn't afraid of abstract multiversal threats. He was afraid of Victor Von Doom specifically, afraid of what happens when a man that brilliant and that ruthless decides that the sacred timeline is the problem. So he took Doom's most dangerous qualities, the genius, the obsession, and he transplanted them into a variant designed to aim all of that somewhere safe. And that experiment worked. But not because of Tony, because of Steve. Steve Rogers was the variable that kept Victor Von Doom from bleeding all the way through. Every time Tony drifted toward the darkness that He Who Remains feared most, Steve pulled him back. He Who Remains planned for Tony. He planned for the snap. He planned for almost everything. What he didn't plan for was how load-bearing that relationship actually was. And Victor Von Doom, the real one, he knows that Steve Rogers was the reason the experiment worked. Which means Steve Rogers is the reason Victor Von Doom lost everything. And now Doom is standing at his door. So now we get to the part that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I first started putting this video together. Because everything Doom does when he arrives at Steve's door is calculated. Every word, every gesture, every carefully placed revelation. This is not a man who showed up unprepared. This is a man who spent years studying Steve Rogers, understanding exactly how he thinks, exactly what he values, and exactly where he can be reached. And Doom knows that the way you reach Steve Rogers is through guilt. He tells Steve that his family is dead, that the time travel, Steve's choice at the end of Endgame, the stones, the manipulation of the sacred timeline, it set off a chain of events that destroyed everything Doom loved. And he says it with the kind of grief that is impossible to fake. Except I don't think Steve killed Doom's family. I think Doom did. Because that's who Victor Von Doom is at his core. A man who has sacrificed the people closest to him for something he decided was greater. Who has looked at the people he loved and made the cold calculation that the mission matters more. And they built a story around it that pointed the finger somewhere else. Doom doesn't just defeat you. He makes you feel responsible for your own defeat. And Steve Rogers, who spent his entire life taking responsibility for outcomes he couldn't have predicted, who carried survivor's guilt through every movie, who left his shield behind in Siberia because he couldn't bear the thought of Tony being right about him, Steve is going to feel that in a way that is going to affect every decision he makes for the rest of this movie. And here's where Marvel is doing something that I think is genuinely masterful, because Doom isn't just manipulating Steve emotionally. He's presenting him with something far more specific and far more cruel than that. He is telling Steve that his most personal choice, the one beautiful, selfish thing Steve Rogers ever did for himself, that choice had a cost. That somewhere in the ripple of that decision, in the chain of events that followed, the stones in the time travel, and the rewriting of the sacred timeline, a family was destroyed. Victor Von Doom's family. And Steve has to sit with the possibility that the best thing he ever did for himself was the worst thing he ever did to someone else. This is not a coincidence. That is Doom understanding Steve Rogers completely. Understanding that the way you break a man who has never put himself first is to make him feel like the one time he did, it cost everything. And the parallel to the Infinity Saga runs deeper than just emotional manipulation, because these two men are going to end up on opposite sides of something. Doom with his pieces arranged exactly where he needs them, Steve with the heroes who trust him, oriented around a mission that Doom designed. Lines drawn, tensions building. The ghost of every argument Steve and Tony ever had about oversight, about trust, playing out again with different faces and the same impossible stakes. The audience is going to feel that. The characters won't fully understand it, but we will. And that means every hero who trusts Steve starts walking in that same direction, because that's what Steve Rogers is in this movie and every movie he's ever been in. The person everyone else orients around, the moral compass the room uses to find true north. When Steve believes something, when he commits to something, the people around him follow. Not because he asks them to, but because he's Steve. And Doom knows that too. So when Steve leads, Doom wins. The heroes trust Steve. Steve trusts Doom. And by the time anyone realizes what's actually happening, the board is already set exactly where Doom needs it to be. But there is one more thing. And this is the moment I teased at the beginning of this video. The thing I said would be the most devastating moment in this entire film. We have seen Steve Rogers shaken before. After the snap, standing in that field, looking at the ash on his hands, knowing half of everything was just gone. That broke something in him too. And then Endgame showed us a Steve who was still carrying it, still running support groups, still trying to help people move through a grief that he himself hadn't moved through. The snap was a wound that the whole world shared, enormous and devastating, and communal in a way that at least meant Steve wasn't carrying it alone. What Doom does to Steve's son is nothing like that. The rumors surrounding Doomsday suggest that near the end of the movie, when Steve has finally seen through the manipulation, when he goes to Latveria to confront Doom directly, Doom kills Steve's son in front of him. And I have been sitting with that rumor, trying to figure out how to talk about it, because I'm not a father yet, and I think there is something about that specific loss, a parent watching their child taken from them, that you cannot fully conceptualize until you've loved something that completely. Until you have looked at another person and understood that your own life matters less than theirs does. The people who were kids in 2008, sitting in theaters watching Iron Man for the first time, a lot of them are fathers now. They grew up with Steve Rogers. They watched him sacrifice everything across 11 years of storytelling. And some of them are going to sit in that theater and watch Steve Rogers lose his son and feel something that goes beyond being a Marvel fan. Something that reaches into their actual lives, their actual families, the thing that they love most in the world, sitting next to them in the dark. I think Marvel knows that. I think they've always known who their audience is and how they've grown alongside these characters. And I think Doomsday is reaching for something that hits completely differently depending on where you are in life when you watch it. Because fatherhood is everywhere in this movie. Doom had a child. Thor has a child. Reed has a child that Doom wants. Steve has a child. It's not an accident that every major player in this story has something that small and that irreplaceable to lose, because there is no loss like that loss. There is no wound that reaches deeper, and there is no version of Steve Rogers, not the soldier, not the Avenger, not the man who walked toward Thanos' army alone, that is built to survive it. We have never seen this version of Steve Rogers, and I don't think any of us are ready for it. He Who Remains built the architecture of an entire timeline around one question. Can you take the darkest, most dangerous version of a person and reshape them into something good by giving them the right life, the right people, the right reasons to care? And the answer, as Tony Stark proved across 11 years of storytelling, is yes. Nurture is real. Environment is real. The people around you matter in ways that go deeper than most of us ever stop to appreciate. But Steve Rogers was never that argument. Steve Rogers was never a nature versus nurture question because there was never any tension between the two. What he was at his core and what his life shaped him into pointed in exactly the same direction from the very beginning. The serum just made it visible to the rest of the world. And every person Steve ever loved, they didn't change him. They revealed him. They gave him more reasons to be exactly who he already was. And I think that's why Doom cannot beat him cleanly. Why the manipulation has to be so precise and so personal, because you cannot redirect Steve Rogers the way He Who Remains redirected Doom. You cannot rewrite him. You cannot aim him somewhere else. The only way to stop Steve Rogers is to break him from the inside. And even then, I'm not sure it takes. Which brings me to the question that I think is at the very heart of everything we've been building toward in this series. What actually makes a hero? Not the tragedy or the power or the origin story. We've all seen those things produce villains just as easily as heroes. So what is it specifically? What is the thing that makes Steve Rogers, and not someone else wearing the same suit? That's what we're going to get into next time. And I think by the time we're done, you're going to see this whole story. Tony, Doom, Steve, all of it in a completely different light. I'll see you there.